Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the healthcare lawyers at Epstein, Becker, Green, a leading law firm that has more than 40 years' experience serving clients in the healthcare industry nationwide.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Diagnosing Healthcare. I'm Megan Robertson, returning as your host for today's episode. I'm an attorney in Epstein, Becker, Green's Healthcare and Life Sciences practice in our Washington, D.C. office. This episode, we are focusing on a growing part of my own practice, actually, which is cannabis law. As the consumer interest in cannabis or cannabis-derived products grows, so too the opportunities for investment in cannabis businesses also grow, along with the scrutiny by federal and state regulators. While there are many different government agencies at play in the cannabis law field, today we're primarily going to focus on the status of FDA's stance on cannabis regulation. So before we dive in, I'd like to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to the relevant cannabis terminology. Cannabis, marijuana, and hemp each have distinct meanings, which are important in understanding the regulatory arena. So let's start with cannabis. Cannabis, or cannabis sativa, if you want to use its proper name, is the overall plant species to which marijuana and hemp belong. Marijuana is a variety of cannabis that contains more than 0.3% tetrahydrocannabinol, also known as THC, which is a psychoactive compound. Marijuana is currently a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law. Hemp, on the other hand, is a different variety of cannabis that contains less than 0.3% THC by dry weight. Since the Agriculture Improvement Act of 2018, also known as the Farm Bill, was enacted, hemp is no longer considered a Schedule I controlled substance. Finally, I also want to touch on cannabidiol, also known as CBD. CBD is a compound that's part of a family of cannabinoids that can be extracted from cannabis, including both marijuana and hemp. While CBD and THC are both cannabinoids, CBD does not produce the same psychoactive effect, what we know as a high, as THC does. So in a nutshell, at a very high level, out of that cannabis family, marijuana is a controlled substance and hemp is not. But we'll get into why that matters as we go along more today. The cannabis industry in recent years has put pressure on FDA to issue some form of a definitive rulemaking on its regulation of cannabis, as well as cannabis-derived products, especially those developed using hemp, since it's no longer a controlled substance. Today, we're going to talk about the status of FDA's plan for regulating these products and what actions the agency has taken recently to move that ball forward. Now, I am pleased to welcome my colleague, Delia Deshane. Delia is a member of the firm at EBG and maintains a practice in cannabis law, advising clients not only on cannabis-specific laws and regulations, but also on the associated legal and compliance risks that are related to FDA, the DEA, and the Controlled Substance Act. She has a deep background in advising clients who are developing cannabinoid drug products, conventional food and dietary supplement manufacturers, ancillary marijuana businesses, and hemp cultivators and product retailers. Needless to say, we're dealing with a very complex regulatory landscape with many interesting and intersecting parts. But hopefully we can untangle some of that for our listeners today. Delia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Megan. I started advising clients on the federal and state regulation of cannabis about 8 years ago, when state laws related to the manufacture, distribution, and possession of marijuana began to change. At the time, there were very few practitioners who understood the complex scheme under which DEA, FDA, and NIDA regulate cannabis. Naturally, given my deep background in controlled substances regulation, clients came to me for advice. Since then, I've had the good fortune of being able to work with clients on some of the most interesting issues in cannabis law and policy, including the challenges to removing marijuana from Schedule I of the Federal Controlled Substances Act, the need to address inequities in the criminal justice system related to marijuana prosecutions, the potential public harm caused by marijuana misuse, abuse, and diversion, and the need to provide Americans access to safe and effective medications. I've also been able to witness what I believe to be a radical change in the federal control of cannabis, in particular with respect to the domestic cultivation of hemp. Through Congress's enactment of the 2014 and 2018 Farm Bills, hemp may now be lawfully cultivated in the United States. This has opened the door for research and development of new medical therapies containing cannabinoids, the manufacture and sale of agricultural commodities containing hemp, and created a burgeoning industry for hemp consumer products. Also, as we've started to learn more about the plant's therapeutic potential, the interest in developing medical therapies that contain cannabinoids has exponentially grown. FDA has approved the first drug product derived from cannabis, cannabidiol, and there are several other cannabinoid drug products in development. I can also say that I've had the rare opportunity to see two core components of my controlled substances practice intersect. As we learn more about the potential therapeutic benefits that cannabis can provide, companies have begun to contemplate some of those benefits may include the use of cannabis as an effective non-opioid alternative for the treatment of pain, as well as its potential utility in substance use disorder treatment. It's been a fascinating and fulfilling journey to date, and I'm thrilled to have been given the opportunity to bring my experience and knowledge to the healthcare and life sciences team at EBG.
Well, we are very excited to have you both at EBG and on this podcast today. I think we're going to go ahead and dive into our first topic for discussion, which is there's sort of a gray area that the industry is currently facing when it comes to FDA's regulation of hemp-derived products. The most prominent of these, I think, relates to the manufacture and marketing of products containing CBD derived from hemp. So the industry would argue that because hemp is no longer a controlled substance, the CBD that is extracted from hemp is also deregulated and therefore should be given more slack when it comes to FDA regulation of CBD products, like edibles and dietary supplements that people might see on the market. So let's talk about FDA's current position about the inclusion of CBD as an ingredient in these types of products.
Sure. So it's FDA's current position that neither CBD nor THC can lawfully be included as ingredients in conventional foods and dietary supplements. And this is because FDA has concluded that those ingredients have been subject to substantial clinical investigations that have been made public. And these ingredients were not first marketed as a conventional food or dietary supplement. This conclusion is based on statutory provisions in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as well as FDA's interpretation and understanding of the available evidence regarding the marketing of CBD and THC products. FDA has said that it's not received any information which indicates that THC or CBD were included in foods or dietary supplements before substantial clinical investigations were initiated into these ingredients. However, FDA has opened the door for interested parties to provide that information. Also, in a never-before-seen move, FDA has indicated that it is willing to promulgate regulations or willing to consider promulgating regulations that would allow for the marketing of conventional foods or dietary supplements that contain CBD. FDA held a public meeting to consider that potential rulemaking in May 2019, and it also opened a public docket for interested parties to submit comments and information related to that rulemaking. FDA has iterated the need for data upon which it can base its rulemaking, including data that elucidates the risk of cumulative exposure to CBD.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember that May 2019 meeting because I think it lasted about 8 hours. It was broadcasted and 8 hours of stakeholder comment, and in addition to written comments that industry was able to provide. And I think one of the primary concerns that became clear, not only from that public meeting, but also through FDA's just kind of public comments and whatnot to date, is that one of FDA's primary concerns related not only to CBD products, but also to the broader cannabis and cannabis-derived product market is safety to the consumer. And typically, a manufacturer of a product is able to mitigate sort of these safety concerns by showing data from research that's been conducted on the safety of the product. But here, we have a unique situation where research on marijuana has actually historically been limited because researchers have only been able to obtain marijuana domestically from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which contracts with the University of Mississippi. So let's talk now about how the opportunities for cannabis research with respect to some of these safety concerns that FDA has changed in recent years. And what do you envision as being some of the remaining hurdles that researchers need to overcome?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. That's a great question. I think the issue of research into not only CBD, but other cannabinoids, as well as the marijuana plant more generally, is a really important one, especially if we're going to move forward to having a clearer regulatory scheme in place that aligns with the public's interest. So as I mentioned earlier, the 2018 Farm Bill opened the door for clinical researchers to obtain cannabinoids, including CBD, from hemp cultivated in the US. That now obviates the need for researchers to obtain a federal Schedule I DEA researcher license and the need for them to obtain the research material from NIDA or through importation. So that's an important change and an important opportunity for researchers to access material in a less cumbersome way than they could historically. Also, in 2015, the Department of Health and Human Services removed the requirement that non-federally funded marijuana research undergo a separate review and approval by a Public Health Services Committee. And so in so doing, HHS removed some of the inefficiencies and, more importantly, some of the obstacles in obtaining marijuana for clinical research in the U.S. Unfortunately, while these developments are a significant step forward, and we shouldn't discount them, there are still limitations, practical and otherwise, on performing research in the U.S. So for starters, it's important to keep in mind that the domestic hemp industry is still very nascent. So while the U.S. Department of Agriculture has approved several state hemp plans and farmers can cultivate hemp for research or commercial use under those plans, the requirements for processing hemp vary from state to state. And also, many hemp cultivators are struggling to comply with USDA's new regulations and the underlying state plans that have been enacted. So in light of this, there's still a degree of inconsistency between the material that can be obtained in the US, as well as some concerns about the quality of that research material and whether it's suitable for clinical research in the US. I think some of the concerns that researchers have is whether hemp producers have the quality systems in place that are necessary to grow and process cannabis that is suitable for use in clinical research. And FDA recently issued a guidance that's very helpful on this point and points out some of the key considerations for sponsors that are interested in conducting clinical research on cannabis, and in particular, the quality considerations that need to be made, including ensuring batch-to-batch consistency and the inclusion of impurities in the research material. So I think, as I mentioned before, there have been a lot of really positive developments and an improvement in access or potential access to cannabis and cannabinoids for research, but there are still some challenges that exist practically in the marketplace. Of course, alternative to the lawful hemp cultivation pathway, researchers can also still obtain cannabis through NIDA's drug supply program. However, there have historically been concerns, right or wrong, about the scope and quality of research material that's available through NIDA's drug supply program. DEA did recently propose regulations that would allow for the registration of additional cultivators of marijuana for research in the U.S., and therefore opportunities for better access may be on the horizon.
Yeah, and which is great. And, so again, it's kind of like a qualified great, right? Because like you said, while there's been some positive movement, a lot of barriers still exist for researchers to kind of create that initial threshold comfortable level for FDA of safety with respect to these products. Would you agree with that kind of overall summary?
Yes, I think so. Although I would also point out that there is some safety data that exists with respect to CBD. A lot of that data was part of the new drug application that was reviewed by FDA in support of approval of cannabidiol as an FDA-approved drug product. It's not as though we're lacking no data. I think that just some of the data that FDA is asking for is, as you indicate, it's difficult to accumulate, especially given the impediments to getting an IND approved that contains for research on cannabis material, as well as having a clinical study that will generate data that FDA considers to be reliable enough to demonstrate the safety profile of the CBD consumer product at issue. So yes, I think that's a fair assessment that there are certainly still challenges that exist. The hemp consumer product industry is continuing to fight an uphill battle.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of tying all of this back, that's a great segue, actually. We have the product manufacturers segment of the industry, really anxious for rulemaking from FDA, particularly on its regulation of CBD, in conventional foods and dietary supplements. But one thing that we're seeing is that this actually isn't only impacting the production of products and the manufacturing of product. Recently, actually, multiple federal courts have issued stays on class actions that have been brought by consumers against manufacturers of CBD consumer products that have actually already been on the market. Essentially, the judges are saying that they won't make a decision on those cases until FDA issues some sort of rulemaking or further definitive guidance. So now the question, not only from industry when it comes to the manufacturers of products and researchers, but also from consumers who have questions about these products and their regulation, is when and how will FDA follow through? Which, I know part of that is kind of looking into a crystal ball and best guesswork there, but we do know some things. We know that the agency recently sent a CBD enforcement policy to the White House OMB, the Office for Management and Budget, for review. Do you think steps like that and the clinical guidance that you mentioned earlier are a reflection of the direction that we think FDA is going when it comes to regulating these products?
Yes, I do. I predict that FDA's CBD enforcement discretion guidance, if it's approved by OMB, may in fact be a short-term fix to the challenge that FDA is facing in both addressing the proliferation of CBD conventional foods and dietary supplements in the marketplace and preserving incentives for developing drug products that contain cannabinoids or other natural substances. Although this wouldn't be a cure-all for the issues that are currently facing the CBD consumer product industry, it may provide some comfort to businesses that operate in this space, as well as their lenders and investors. Regardless of the changes that occur at the federal level, however, there still needs to be adequate due diligence that's conducted on a cannabis business by companies that are seeking to engage and invest in them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could probably go on and talk about this for hours. I know that you and I probably could, but I think that this is actually all we have time for today. Delia, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today about cannabis law. This is such an interesting new field.
You're welcome, Megan. Thank you for having me.
As a recap for our listeners, FDA's current position on CBD in conventional food and dietary supplements, right now it remains in place in that CBD can't be included as an ingredient in a conventional food or dietary supplement. But that said, the agency is actively working towards a new sort of regulatory regime, be it through enforcement discretion or proposed rulemaking, to work with researchers and product manufacturers alike toward a modified regulatory landscape for hemp-derived products, including CBD products. FDA has not indicated a time frame for this new plan to be released, but based on recent activity like the OMB proposal that was submitted, we will be watching and waiting anxiously for any updates from the agency on that front. And with that, I think that is all we have time for today. On behalf of EBG, thank you for tuning in. I'm Megan Robertson, and this has been Diagnosing Healthcare.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Healthcare. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. The Employment Law This Week and Diagnosing Healthcare podcasts are presented by Epstein, Becker, and Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of the legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.